Pat, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Hi, Pat. Richard here. Haven't seen you in ages. Lovely to see you again.
Good to see you too, Richard.
Pat, where are you coming from today?
Boulder, Colorado.
Boulder, Colorado. And you've been there for a while?
Yeah, since the 70s. I came out here to apprentice with Ron Kurtz back in the days when you could still do that sort of thing.
Well, there's an instant segue.
It is.
There's an important name in the whole story. Tell us a little bit about you and Ron Kurtz.
Well, I met Ron in the early 70s. I was working in a psychiatric hospital teaching yoga and dance. Because I was interested in the body, having practiced yoga, for a really long time, learned it from a book because nobody was teaching yoga back then. And Ron was the first person that I met who had the idea that the body was important in psychotherapy, that the body was, he would talk about it as an access route. The patterns and movement and sensations of the body would be like an access route into implicit material. And I was fascinated. So he asked me to organize for him in Nashville, Tennessee, where I was living. So I did at the psychiatric hospital and for a workshop for the general public. And then he brought me to Boulder in the 70s, where he was teaching at the Boulder School of Massage. And I started studying with him. And I learned his work through sitting in with his sessions with his clients, which is a very unusual way to learn. It was really an apprenticeship. And I assisted him. We traveled around the country and I assisted him at his workshops. And he was the best teacher I've ever had by far. Very innovative, very much ahead of his time.
Now that legacy, you've continued that legacy, haven't you? And
yes.
the Hakomi method at the Institute. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Ron and I and a few others founded the Hakomi method in 1980. And in 1981, I remember sitting with him at a restaurant and said, I love Hakomi, but I'm much more interested in the body than you are. I was studying structural integration and I was teaching massage and, I grew up dancing and was still studying dance and movement. And he said, well, start your own branch and call it Hakomi Bodywork. So from then on, I was teaching my own work, which was his work. Ron's work strongly impacted it. But Ron really didn't work directly with trauma. And that was another huge influence for me in the late 70s, because I was an adjunct therapist for the university clinic here in Boulder. And they were sending me women who were unresponsive sexually. And I didn't know anything about trauma. Who's talking about trauma in 77, 78? So I was working with, relationship issues and strong emotions, and my clients were getting worse. And I was just baffled. And I remember saying to my friend, well, maybe I could just keep them in their bodies. The heck with all the emotional work. And that was really the dawn of my own learning about trauma from those clients, because they started at least not getting worse. And some got better,
Isn't it fascinating, this development over time, as you're putting it there, giving us this timeline, the 70s, we weren't talking about this. But now as we move forward, there's still some resistance, I think, or some lack of grasping it. But this idea that we are an entire entity, that we don't have a set of emotions that aren't related to the body, or we don't have emotional responses that aren't related to our head. And this is something that you were just doing back then intuitively, saying maybe these things are all connected.
Right.
And they are. As you went along in those days, was there resistance to the work you were doing, or what was the public, sort of the professional type of response?
Well, it varied, There was When I would talk about it, I remember somebody said, "Oh, you just don't want to go into those strong emotions," which I didn't think was true, because I go there with clients who can, work at the edges of the window, terminology we didn't have back then. But there was a real lack of understanding for decades. I mean, Judy Herman's book didn't come out until 1992. Charles Figley's book was a bit earlier, but it wasn't really widely integrated into psychotherapy. Yeah, so it was. I felt on my own for about a decade until I met Bessel and Alan and everybody else in the interpersonal neurobiology.
Now, I know you best for sensorimotor psychotherapy. So where was the beginnings of that? Where were you formulating that?
Well, that was really in 1981 when I started my own branch of Hakomi. And then the name changed. Ron and I both left the Hakomi Institute in the 90s. And that was when I chose the name Sensorimotor Psychotherapy.
Right.
I felt like it was a more descriptive name of actually what my work is. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a colleague the other day who's involved in sensorimotor stuff, loves obviously doing a lot of your work. And she said, are we actually getting now a rebalancing or even a shift in the balance where people are less inclined towards cognitive treatment work and more inclined towards somatic? Are you seeing any particular movement, or what are your feelings about that?
Well, that's a great hope. I think that would be wonderful because the body participates in everything we do, and especially when we're looking at trauma. I mean, trauma will impact the body first and foremost. So working from the top down with trauma doesn't, to me, make a whole lot of sense. But I think you're right. I mean, when I first started teaching, my work was very fringe. Nobody had heard of the wisdom of the body. I remember one person when I said I did, body therapy, they thought I worked on cars.
Yeah, you look like a mechanic.
Because the consciousness just wasn't there. And even when I met Bessel and that whole crew, nobody knew anything about working with the body. And it looked very strange to people who were psychoanalytically and psychodynamically trained. Now everybody has an approach that incorporates the body, EMDR, everybody. So that's gratifying to see.
Yes, I was blessed to marry a remedial massage therapist who's also a nurse, who's also a lifestyle medicine person. And so and we worked together and we just sort of shuffled them between the rooms. It's
that's fantastic. That's what Ron and I did.
Yeah.
I was doing massage in the 70s in a massage school, and I would do the body work, and then I'd go in with the client and he would do the psychotherapy part. And,
it's a beautiful thing.
That's great. Great combo.
Yeah. Your book, Sensorimotor Psychotherapy, Interventions for Trauma and Attachment, which has been just so wonderful for me as a practitioner because it's so practical. I mean, every chapter has so many, really practical worksheets that I have just used so much. This must have taken decades to assimilate, right?
Oh, just before you answer, for those who we're able to see each other. That's a big book. Man.
It is this is a huge book, and I think it's also a large format book because of the worksheets, which Norton have done an amazing job with. But it is just so packed with so much information. I've been using it for a long time, and I doubt I've used half of the worksheet. So I've tried my darndest to experiment with as much as I can. But yeah, tell us a little bit about what it's taken to bring this together.
Well, it's interesting because that's a book I actually didn't want to write.
Oh, really?
I had written Trauma in the Body with Kenny Minton and Claire Payne. It came out in 2006. And then Deborah Malmud from my publisher, Norton, called and wanted me to write a workbook. And I said, I don't really believe in workbooks. And, it's all about the relationship. So I don't really want to write a workbook. And she tried to talk me into it. And then finally said, well, if you won't write a workbook that's a sequel, I'm going to find somebody else to do it. And so I said, okay, I'll do it, but I have to think about how to do it. So I wrote this book really for therapists to work together with their clients. I mean, knowing some people will just use it on their own, some clients, so people with trauma. And it was, once I got started, I couldn't really limit it, you know?
Yep.
So
Right.
Huge book that it does give a lot of psychoeducation and worksheets that are meant to be worked on together with your therapist. So it's nice to hear you using it with clients rather than
look, if there's anything that is, you're talking about, you wanted it to be relational. I mean, this is the thing that the bridge for me that has made being relational with traumatized clients so much easier.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
No, you did an extraordinary job, Pat. It actually feels like you're coming out of the book.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Cool.
It's really lovely. It's really lovely.
Well, I've always used worksheets since the 70s when I first started seeing clients, because it takes practice for things to really change, especially if we're looking at somatic shifts. You know, like I'm also certified in the Rolf method of structural integration. So I pay a lot of attention to posture and movement, and if the body is, you know, at peace with gravity, and, you know, how gestures are made and all. And to change those imprints takes a lot of practice. So I think worksheets are invaluable.
Yeah.
Well, this is a beaut segue, I think, to what is now. Let's see how easy and cooperative you were with what has just been next produced by Norton's recently, or we're coming out soon, is the handbook of
Pocket guide. Yeah.
Pocket guide.
Yeah.
What's going on there? And I know you'll slip in, but I'll open the door for you to just sort of go into that first chapter, which has this wonderful word, sociocultural. Let me just open that doorway and let you go for it.
Well, let me tell you how this came about. You know, my family is biracial. You know, I grew up in the 60s, so I participated in the civil rights marches, and I taught at an all-black school. Then I taught in the first integrated school in the very early, late 60s, 69, 70, I think. And so I kind of thought I had a handle on racism, you know, and I found out, I think it was in 2015, that I didn't at all. And it was because we were doing a conference at my suggestion. You might remember this, Richard.
Oh, very well.
UCLA and Lifespan Learning Institute. Well, it was right after Ferguson had happened. And I thought we should do a conference on culture. You know, it's really time now. And so I suggested it, thinking it was a great idea. And it was through that experience that I found out how little I knew. That I really didn't know what it meant to be white. I really didn't have a sense of the day-to-day privilege oppression dynamics. And at that conference, I worked together with a couple colleagues, well, Medria Connolly specifically, and Brian Nichols, who had always attended that conference, and they're both African-American. And they had come up to me at the conference before, after I just mentioned the word diversity. And they said, you know, we're really interested in this. So we joined forces to do a presentation and a panel. And I was so ignorant that and what I realized was, as a white person, I mean, my only, you know, marginalized status is that I'm a woman. Well, and that I suppose that I'm elderly now. I guess that's definitely marginalized status too. But other than that, I've got all the advantage. I've got all the privilege and advantages. And I realized how blind I was to systemic oppression and racialized trauma and all of it, because none of it affects me personally in that way, you know? So that's the backstory. So when Norton wanted me to write a pocket guide, I said, great. And it's got to be about sociocultural perspective, the whole book. So the title of it is Sensorimotor Psychotherapy in Context.
Right.
And I learned so much writing this book. And I worked with 4 people of color as consultants and co-authors on the first chapter because I couldn't write this book by myself. So I hired people and we worked together.
It's so beautiful. Jane Elliott, who, of course, did the blue eye, brown eye experiments and those things over the years, she said that very same thing of that word, that ignorance. Our only problem is ignorance. Yeah. And once you ignorant yourself, once you take away that ignorance, things shift, because I would imagine that what we don't realize, particularly in the sort of the white privilege area, is the somatic impact of having a privileged existence, and that it does have that. And I haven't yet read it because it hasn't yet been released. But I'm just wondering how you incorporate these different ideas and the nature of the way those people of color who as Jane Elliott would say, cannot take off their imposition, their social imposition, like we can very often leave the room. Tell us a bit more about how that interweaves and how that tells a story and opens up the framework for the rest of the book.
Well, a big awareness for me in starting to delve into this was that psychotherapy was basically created by, white people, Europeans, for people of that society. So and we're still, it's still true. So, and what happens then is that it starts to silence and diminish and even, judge other voices and other ways of healing and other ways of conceptualizing trauma, its source, its resolution. And I think that was realizing that was a huge thing for me. And I saw it even in my own work, like just little examples. Like I was talking with an Asian woman not long ago, and her body is constricted, as if she's trying to get smaller. And usually, I think of that in terms of attachment relationships, and maybe this is someone who had some trauma, who wanted to be small and not seen, or maybe it's someone who grew up with a family who didn't allow them to be really expressive and be themselves. And as she and I were talking about it, she was like, my family was amazing, really safe, really affirming. She said it was the microaggressions and the oppression from the outside that I always had to be, I wanted to be hidden. I didn't want people to notice me. And so it's just these shifts in thinking, and the thinking that, for many Black people, for example, the trauma is not over. For marginalized people, the trauma is not over. Usually we're accustomed to talking about trauma. Well, they were sexually abused through their childhood, and now they're in therapy, and now we're going to, work on the past. But for traumatized people who in marginalized communities, that trauma is ongoing. And they might need their defenses. So I just started looking at how people hold trauma that is past as opposed to how it's held when it's ongoing, and just the impact of living day to day with the systemic oppression that's definitely in the United States, but it's throughout the world. It's everywhere.
Gene Houston at an Erickson conference was doing a fascinating discussion and workshop on working with other cultures, and one of the things that somebody asked about was, they were sort of saying, well, I try to help, but I don't seem to be appreciated, and she did this wonderful little work piece, but fundamentally what you're saying, it is not uncommon for me to go down, particularly to, she was working a lot with American Indian reservation work at the time, and she said to offer all kinds of help and just be told to go away. And this is an interesting aspect of trauma that we see in all people, that what you do is you offer some sort of help, and maybe the head says go away, but the body says go away, as you say, by shrinking, by expanding. Is this something that this language of the body is really important?
Well, I mean, the body is... Oh, I thought I turned this off. I'm so sorry.
No, we're going to dance now. So we'll cut that out.
Well, the language of the body is important in so many ways. I mean, it's if you're tracking the body in these nuanced ways, you will see the pulling in, the slight moving back, the little squint in the eyes. It will show its opinion.
Yes, chapter 2 and chapter 3. Yeah,
but something else about the body is, one of the things that I learned in writing this, for example, I'm a pretty touchy person. I'm comfortable with touch. I like to touch. I'm inclined to touch. Well, not now with COVID, but before this, I was very touchy, that is a sign of privilege. Like, the one with privilege is allowed to touch. People who are deemed to be of a lower status do not touch the ones who have privilege. And this was written about in the 70s, I think, with doctors and nurses. The doctors would often touch the nurses, but the nurses would not initiate touch. So just little things like how we use our bodies, with privilege. It's okay for us to seek proximity and closeness and touch and all. And so I really became much more conscious of how I use my own body in that way. And of course, it's imperative to know the norms of a person's culture. Like, in some cultures, making eye contact is not accepted if a person's an elder. Whereas we in the Western world, we would think, well, eye contact is it's a relational proximity seeking action. And if you're not making eye contact, you probably have problems with attachment, and the expressivity, some cultures are much more expressive and much more emotional. And there's often misdiagnosis and misinterpretation if we're coming from a Western perspective. So all these things are just so critical. And it's astonishing to me that I've spent most of my career not realizing this.
Yeah.
And I think of that quote, James Baldwin, if I can just say this, because I love this quote. We started the book with this quote. It's not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
Wow. Yeah. Beautiful quote.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I ask, when we're talking about cultural differences in terms of healing, what about spirituality? Obviously, huge differences across cultures and people groups.
Yeah, I know. And I think it's, I remember I went to South Africa with Bessel in the late 90s. And I was talking to a bunch of indigenous healers there. We were doing presentations at different trauma centers. And I just showed videotapes because that's kind of what I do. And some of the other presenters were talking a lot about neuroscience and this and that. And these healers were saying they liked the videos because they saw the same symptoms, like people shaking and all of this. He said, but the reason for that, you don't get it. It's not, what you're saying is not the reason. And I'm like, well, what's the reason? And in their beliefs, they need to know where the family member was killed, the spot where they were killed, and do a ritual there to keep that family member who was killed from haunting the family that has symptoms of PTSD. And, those kinds of beliefs are really powerful. And we're not really, Western psychology doesn't really tease those out, and they don't
Not at all.
tease out the spirituality of the person, and a lot of the healing practices of BIPOC people have been denied and criticized even in Western psychology.
Yeah, that sort of flips into through my mind there, the idea that you have, Peter Levine does as well, this idea that we need to complete acts. There's a physical completion of an act done in different ways in different cultures. Right. And that's a beautiful example there. And I just want to jump sort of towards the end of getting a mid range in the book. There is something that's always fascinated me, and I think it's been very important as we talk therapeutic enactments. This situation where the therapist actually creates a problem, and you've actually shown some very bravely, here's Pat sort of screwing it up, but in these cultural things as well, in this cultural frame, talking about those enactments, can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, one of the examples we give in that chapter, for example, is working with a woman. I was working with a woman who was of a lower education, and I was doing some psychoed, kind of explaining to her about trauma and all, and she wasn't really responding. She was just kind of saying as if she understood it all, and that was an example of our different cultures where she felt diminished, because I have a PhD and all of this, and she felt very inferior to that, and I wasn't sensitive to it. So, it can look all kinds of different ways, And another example that this is a composite case where an enactment was avoided, working with an African-American woman, was in the transcript, the therapist, asks, reaches out to the client because the client is talking about being so isolated. So in that reaching out from the therapist to the client, to reach the client, to implicitly communicate, I'm here, you're not so isolated. And the client, again, just got really silent. And what was going on for her was that people always just want something from me. They want sex, they want something, and this and that, and white people always want something from me. And if a therapist at that point just says, well, I don't want anything from you, without reflecting on that, you could really get yourself into an enactment, right? So that self-reflection and going, I wonder, is that true? And then, we always want something from other people. Let's face it, I would want her to not feel alone. And that's a want. Right. Being able to reflect on that and kind of own it, I think is really important. Most white people, when they're confronted with the possibility of an enactment or a microaggression, the first thing that comes to my mind is, but I didn't mean it that way. Wait, you misunderstand. And, we can't do that. We've got to be curious and say, I'm sorry, tell me more.
This is something that you said. I did a discussion of this in an article somewhere, but looking at your work, it's saying that there was those that were saying an enactment is a terrible thing. Freud was sort of saying then you have to go off and have therapy and fix yourselves. But sort of in essence, I got the impression that enactment is also an opportunity for opening a therapeutic doorway. And that's how you use those, I imagine.
Absolutely. I'll tell you a funny story. I had shown a video in New York years ago on of an enactment that really blew up kind of in therapy, and it did resolve, but it was a very difficult session. And my friend and colleague Janina Fisher called me and said, people were so impressed that you would show this and that you would show your mistakes and all. And me being kind of a perfectionist, I got triggered. Is that what they think? Just that I make a bunch of mistakes. And I called Philip Bromberg, who taught me almost everything I know about therapeutic enactments. He passed away last year, sadly. He was just a great teacher. And he said to me, he said, Pat, if you think of these as mistakes, you shouldn't even be talking about enactments. He said, they're anything but mistakes. And the way I think of it is, it's almost like the implicit selves of therapist and client kind of come together, in this clash. But if it's like what you said, Richard, if it's negotiated, both of you reach a higher level of organization, not just the client, but also the therapist.
Yes, the video where you're in a sound stage, got quite a lot of space, and she has the catatonic fingers, and you move backwards and backwards and backwards.
Yes,
I was watching that, and it was beautiful. It was a beauty to watch two people grating and then finding the gentleness and finding the place of reintegrating.
Yeah. Finally, we worked it. We worked it through, and that I write about that in the book. And that session reflected both of our histories, where her mother was very invasive. My father had been killed when I was 3 in an accident, and she was, I think, grieving and just kind of withdrawn. So I was always trying to reach her, and not realizing that my client experienced that as invasive. So when finally I started moving my chair back and she started relaxing and opening up, both of us got our needs met. Not that the therapist has that goal, but it happens. I found I got what I wanted, where she opened up and communicated, and the freezing abated, and she got the distance, that gave her the safety to open up. So
and that at the most extraordinary moment when she said, "Now you can come closer."
Yeah.
And she took ownership of the spatial relationship.
That's right. Yeah, and she beckoned with her hand. Remember, she beckoned to that action.
It was a gasping moment from my experience in the sitting in my chair. People all looked at me.
That's something that the two of you, Richard and Pat, are expert in, is observing the somatic narrative. And now I might be wrong, but from what I've observed, some people seem to have an innate ability to just tune in to what they're seeing with the client, and others seem to be oblivious. Tell us a little bit about, developing this capacity to observe this somatic narrative that's in front of you.
Well, for me, I think it started when I was a little girl. My mother put me in dance class because she knew I was going to be tall. She wanted me to be graceful. And I can still remember the moment in dance class where my teacher, Mrs. Bays, she was trying to teach us about that line and that poise. I was 7 years old, and I just got it. I could see it in her, and I got it in my own body. And I mean, for me, my body has always been a resource. As a kid, I regulated by going out into the woods or going to the lake and just being really active. And then all the study and teaching, I studied massage, postural integration, Rolfing movement, the Rolf method, continuum, dance, so many educational opportunities that I had that really trained me to track the body.
Yeah.
This is reflected. I mean, I'm just writing a bit about Scott Miller's stuff and deliberate practice. That innate capacities are helpful and they give us dispositions, but it's the work you do at it. So, Matt, you've got to keep working at it, which he is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a practice. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and as a Rolfing practitioner, do you know Rolfing?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you have to be able to see a person's body and to figure out where you're going to work with the fascial layer so that body can find its alignment. So you feel, and you have to watch in the movement and see where the restrictions are, and so it's really intensive training.
I learned it in acting school.
Yes, you did.
I still think it was the best place. I can remember our movement teacher saying, "I want you to walk across the room, leading from," and then would nominate various parts of the body.
Yeah.
And we would watch each other leading from the shoulder or leading from the stomach, and our whole walk changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff.
Now,
if I can say one more thing about that for your listeners, one of the best trainings I had in that was Ron and I we would go to the mall and we would sit on a bench and we'd just watch people walk.
Right.
And we would analyze their walk, and sometimes we would walk behind them and take on their walk and make up stories about their lives. And but it's great training, and it's free, so anybody can do that. Yeah.
Well, Walter Matthau used to say that I would not get the mental character, I would get the physical character, and once I got the walk, away I went. How fascinating!
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that's the somatic narrative right there.
Yeah.
Now, before I ask about advice for therapists, Richard, is there anything else you wanted to tease out from the book?
There are a million things, but no, I'm bathing in some just wonderful stuff there. I think we're sort of probably getting up to that time. It's funny, Pat. We did a straw poll because we found out that people stopped listening. That the listening thing ended at a certain time, around about 35, 40 minutes. And they came back to us and they said, that was the length of my commute, or that's as far as I can jog. So we'll sort of, so we're coming up to the end of someone's commute.
Yeah. So Pat, is there little nuggets of advice that you could give our listeners who are, maybe trauma therapists or starting out in therapy in general?
Well, in terms of the body, I would just say be curious. Like be curious about your own body. Your own my body's my laboratory. You can play with movement, like how it feels different if you're standing with your shoulders square from having them hunched or squeezed together. Just being curious and being curious about how others live in their bodies too. It doesn't cost anything to do that.
Yeah.
Wow. And that reflects
free learning
itself. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, Pat, it's been such a pleasure having you on the show. And we really appreciate the work that you've been doing. We'll be sure to point our listeners to all of the resources that you have. In terms of training, what do you have for people?
Oh, well, we have on our website, there's a lot of webinars, and some are free. Like there's at least 2 hours of working on teletherapy, tips for that, for example. And then there are lots of other webinars on aloneness and dissociation and resilience and working with kids. And we have a sliding scale, which is part of our commitment to be accountable to an anti-oppression platform. And then we have trainings. Right now, we're doing them remotely. So, which has been great because people can join trainings who otherwise couldn't join.
Yeah.
And we have, the school has been very proactive in working to shift curriculum, shift our policies all towards an anti-racist, anti-oppression, to uphold that lens. And so all our curriculum has been revised in the last couple of years, and we're working hard to walk what we talk.
Okay, beautiful.
So get into that website, everybody, and explore, because it looks like there's a mountain of marvels and gems in there. So that's fantastic.
Okay, beautiful. Pat, thank you for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast, and we hope we can catch up with you further down the track.
All right, thanks so much.
Yeah. Bye-bye, Pat. So when travel is back, I'll see you again.
Okay, sounds good. Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Ciao.